Thank you for joining us again at Home Field Trivia for our Tampa Bay Buccaneers quiz. Like and subscribe for more content. Leave a comment below. And here we go. True or false, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers joined the NFL in 1976. That is true. The Bucs' original uniforms were known as creamsicle because of their orange and white design. That is true. The Buccaneers' first head coach was John Gruden. That is false. The Buccaneers lost their first 26 games in franchise history. That is true. The Bucs won their first Super Bowl by defeating the Oakland Raiders. That is true. The team's current stadium is Raymond James Stadium. That is true. Mike Evans is the only player in NFL history to start his career with 10 straight 1,000-yard receiving seasons. That is true. The Buccaneers have only ever worn red and pewter as their team colors. That is false. Warren Sapp and Derek Brooks both entered the Hall of Fame as Buccaneers. That is true. Tom Brady joined the Buccaneers in 2019. That is false. The Buccaneers' ship cannon fires after every first down in home games. That is false. Ronde Barber is the only player in NFL history with 40 plus interceptions and 25 plus sacks. That is true. The Buccaneers' first playoff appearance was in 1997. That is false. The Buccaneers have had more number 1 overall draft picks than any other NFL franchise. That is false. The Bucs have beaten every other NFL team at least once. That is true. John Gruden was the youngest head coach to win a Super Bowl at the time. That is true. The Buccaneers went winless 0-14 in their inaugural season. That is true. The Buccaneers' first ever draft pick was defensive end Leroy Selman. That is true. The Buccaneers lost Super Bowl 55 against the Kansas City Chiefs. That is false. Chris Godwin was drafted by the Buccaneers in the first round. That is false. The Buccaneers were once placed in the AFC before moving to the NFC. That is true. The Buccaneers defense in 2002 ranked first in the NFL in both yards and points allowed. That is true. The Buccaneers' first ever Pro Bowler was running back Ricky Bell. That is false. Vinny Testaverde was the Buccaneers quarterback when they drafted him number 1 overall in 1987. That is true. The Buccaneers have only retired 3 jersey numbers. That is false. The Buccaneers' first ever playoff win came against the Philadelphia Eagles. That is true. James Wilder holds the franchise record for the most rushing yards in a single season. That is true. The Buccaneers have had exactly one league MVP in their history. That is false. Brad Johnson threw 22 touchdowns in the Buccaneers' 2002 Super Bowl winning season. That is true. The Buccaneers are the only team to win a Super Bowl in their home stadium. That is true. Thanks for joining us for our Buccaneers quiz. Like and subscribe for more content. Leave a comment below and join us next time for our Titans quiz.